Caleb Miller learned early what it felt like to be invisible. At 15, he had already outlived both of his parents. His father, a quiet mountain hunter, died in an early winter accident years ago. His mother followed not long after, worn down by sickness and grief. Since then, Caleb had been passed from one relative to another, never staying long enough to feel like he belonged anywhere. By the time the story truly began, he was living on the edge of a small mountain settlement, tolerated more than welcomed. People didn't hate Caleb. That would have required effort. They simply didn't see him as worth keeping. He worked odd jobs when he could, hauling firewood, cleaning stables, mending fences. He slept in a drafty shed behind his guardian's house, ate whatever scraps were left after supper, and kept his head down. He had learned that asking for too much only made people tired of you faster. When his guardian died suddenly one cold autumn morning, everything changed. The house went to a distant cousin. The land followed with it. And Caleb, thin, quiet, and still half a child, was left standing in the yard with a small canvas bag and nowhere to go. No one argued about it. No one protested. They spoke in low, practical voices, the way adults do when they have already decided something is inevitable. He's old enough to fend for himself. Winter's coming, but we can't feed another mouth. He's a good kid, just not our responsibility. Caleb heard every word. By sundown, he was walking away from the settlement with his bag slung over one shoulder. Inside it were only a few things that mattered. A worn hunting knife that had belonged to his father, a small notebook filled with uneven handwriting and sketches of traps and wind patterns, and a wool blanket patched so many times it barely resembled its original color. The mountain rose ahead of him, gray and unforgiving. Halfway up the slope, set into the rock like a dark open mouth, was the cave. Everyone in the settlement knew about it, and everyone avoided it. They said it was damp, that the cold settled deep inside it, that animals sometimes disappeared near its entrance. Parents used it as a warning for their children. Behave or you'll end up living in that cave. Caleb stood there for a long time staring. The wind cut through his thin coat, sharp and biting. Snowflakes drifted down, light for now but steady. He knew what winter in the mountains meant. He'd seen strong men lose fingers to frost. He'd watched families abandon homes when the cold proved stronger than their walls. Slowly, he stepped closer to the cave entrance. Cold air flowed out, but not the way he expected. It wasn't wild or screaming. It was steady, calm, almost breathing. Caleb remembered his father's voice, low and patient, explaining how stone held temperature, how wind behaved, how nature always followed rules if you bothered to learn them. Maybe, he thought, this place wasn't a death sentence. Maybe it was a test. Behind him, the settlement lights flickered weakly in the distance. Ahead of him was darkness, silence, and the unknown. Caleb tightened his grip on his father's knife, took one last look back, and stepped into the cave, unaware that this choice would one day decide who lived and who didn't. The first night inside the cave was colder than Caleb expected, but not the kind of cold that panicked you. It was steady, quiet. The wind outside screamed across the mountainside, but inside the cave, the sound softened, like it had traveled too far and finally lost its strength. Caleb wrapped himself in his patch blanket and sat with his back against the stone wall, listening. He didn't sleep much, but he stayed alive, and by morning, that felt like enough. Daylight revealed what the darkness had hidden. The cave wasn't a deep, dripping hole like people claimed. The entrance was wide, facing southeast, shielded from the worst of the wind. Inside, the floor sloped gently upward, dry underfoot. Farther back, the air turned cooler, almost the same temperature, no matter where Caleb stood. When he pressed his palm against the stone, it felt solid and patient, unchanging. That mattered. Caleb remembered his father explaining things most people never noticed. How wind always searched for weaknesses, how heat escaped upward, how stone didn't breathe the way wood did. Nature's not cruel, his father used to say. She's honest. She does exactly what she's meant to. By the second day, Caleb stopped thinking of the cave as shelter and started seeing it as a structure. He didn't plan to live in the cave. He planned to live with it. Using fallen timber from the slope below, he dragged short logs to the entrance, muscles burning, breath sharp in his chest. He built a small frame just inside the cave mouth, positioning it where the stone ceiling arched highest. The cave would be his shield. The wooden walls would be his warmth. It wasn't pretty, but it was intentional. He packed gaps with clay and moss, tested the draft with his hand, adjusted again. He cut a narrow vent for smoke, shaping it carefully so the wind wouldn't force it back inside. He learned fast, because mistakes in the mountains didn't give second chances. A week later, people noticed. Men hauling supplies up the pass slowed when they saw smoke curling from the cave. A few climbed partway up the slope out of curiosity. They didn't come close. They didn't need to. Kid finally lost his mind, someone said, laughing. Building a shack in a cave like some animal. Caleb heard them. The sound carried easily on cold air. He didn't answer. He kept working. Inside his small wooden space, he carved shelves into the rock where the stone stayed coldest. He set aside a shallow pit near a crack, where water seeped steadily, never freezing. He dried strips of rabbit meat on a line near the ceiling, where warmth collected. Each choice came from observation, not hope. At night, he sat by his small fire, writing in his father's notebook. Sketches, notes, angles of wind, places where frost formed first. He wasn't dreaming, he was preparing. Down in the settlement, winter talk grew louder. Roof repairs, firewood shortages, worries about storms that came early and stayed late. People trusted their houses because they always had. They trusted tradition more than terrain. They trusted each other. Caleb trusted the mountain. When snow began to fall in earnest, thick and relentless, laughter from below faded. The cave grew quieter, heavier, as if bracing itself. Caleb added another layer to his door, sealed cracks, stacked wood higher than his shoulders. He stood at the entrance one evening, watching the settlement lights flicker in the distance, small and fragile against the dark. They still thought he was foolish. Caleb tightened his gloves and stepped back inside. Winter was coming, and this time he was ready. The mountains didn't ease into winter. They slammed into it. By early December, snow stopped falling gently and started arriving sideways, driven by winds that cut through layers of wool like knives. The trails disappeared first, then the fences. What had once been familiar land turned into a white, shifting maze where distance and direction meant nothing. Down in the settlement, people told themselves this winter was no different from the last. They patched roofs, stacked firewood higher, and checked their chimneys with confident hands. Most of the houses were built the same way. Log walls, steep roofs, narrow flues, copied from places where winters were harsh but not merciless. Tradition gave them comfort. Familiar shapes felt safe. Caleb noticed the first signs others ignored. The wind didn't just blow harder. It changed direction, curling back on itself, testing every corner. At night, he heard it probe the cave entrance, searching, retreating, then returning from another angle. Inside his shelter, the temperature stayed steady, but only because he stayed alert. He adjusted vents, shifted stones, added weight where the door rattled. He learned fast, or he didn't survive. One morning, he climbed to the cave entrance and looked down at the settlement. Smoke rose unevenly from chimneys, some thin, some thick, some barely visible at all. That worried him. Weak smoke meant poor draft. Poor draft meant smoke inside. Smoke inside meant fire risk or suffocation. He remembered his father saying, "Cold doesn't kill fast, it wears you down first." As the days shortened, trouble followed. A roof collapsed on the east side of town under the weight of heavy snow. No one was hurt, but it shook people's confidence. A chimney fire burned through a cabin near the creek, leaving a family with nothing but the clothes they escaped in. Others began rationing wood earlier than planned. Still, no one looked toward the mountain. Up in the cave, Caleb's routine tightened. He woke before dawn, checked airflow, rebuilt his fire from banked coals, and inspected the stone around his shelter for cracks or frost seepage. He counted supplies every night, not because he was afraid, but because he refused to be careless. Then came the warning signs that made his stomach knot. Animals vanished. No birds, no tracks. Even the wind changed pitch, dropping low and constant, like something holding its breath. The sky took on a dull, metallic color that pressed down on the land. Caleb felt it in his bones before he understood it with his mind. A storm was coming, not a regular one. He spent 2 full days preparing. He doubled his wood supply inside the cave. He reinforced the door with another layer of timber and felt. He cleared the smoke vent, reshaped it to fight backdraft, and sealed gaps with frozen clay and moss. When his hands cracked and bled, he wrapped them and kept going. Down below, people did what they always did. They trusted their walls. The blizzard arrived just after sunset. The wind didn't howl. It screamed. Snow didn't fall. It attacked. Visibility vanished within minutes, swallowed by white chaos. The temperature dropped so fast Caleb felt it even inside the cave, like the cold was trying to remember him. Inside his shelter, smoke fought the wind, curling back before finding its way out. He adjusted the fire again and again, careful not to let it die, careful not to let it rage. Outside, something crashed, wood snapping, maybe a roof giving way. Caleb sat with his back against the stone listening. He was afraid, anyone would be, but fear didn't control him, preparation did. As the storm swallowed the mountain and erased the settlement below, one truth settled heavily in the dark. Whatever happened next, nothing would be the same again. The storm did not pass overnight. It stayed. Hour after hour, the wind battered the mountain like it meant to tear it apart. Snow packed itself against the cave entrance in thick rising walls. The sound outside was no longer a scream, but a relentless roar. Deep, unbroken, exhausting. Time lost meaning. Caleb measured the days by how often he had to adjust the fire and clear drifting snow from the entrance. Inside the cave, the cold pressed in, testing every decision he'd made. On the first night, smoke began to push back through the vent as the wind shifted. Caleb reacted fast, lowering the fire, reshaping the draft with a slab of stone and a damp cloth. His eyes burned. His lungs ached. But the smoke thinned, then cleared. He sat there afterward, shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing how close he'd come to disaster. On the second day, the door began to leak. Fine snow slipped through the smallest cracks, gathering along the floor like white sand. Caleb packed moss into the gaps, pressed frozen clay over it, and braced the frame with extra timber. His fingers went numb, then painful, then numb again. He worked anyway. Somewhere down below, wood snapped. It wasn't one sharp break. It was a series of dull, heavy sounds, like the land itself giving up. Caleb pressed his forehead against the stone wall and listened, knowing exactly what it meant. Roofs collapsing, beams failing, homes built to endure normal winters surrendering to an unforgiving one. By the third night, silence crept in. The wind still howled, but underneath it was something worse. Stillness, the kind that follows destruction. Caleb slept in short bursts, waking every hour to check the fire, the walls, the ceiling. He spoke out loud to keep himself grounded, his voice small but steady in the darkness. When the storm finally broke, it did so without warning. The wind faded first, falling away like something exhausted. Snow drifted gently for a while, then stopped altogether. A pale, brittle light filtered into the cave entrance. The world outside looked unfamiliar, buried, reshaped, erased. Caleb stepped out carefully, boots sinking deep with every step. The path down the mountain was gone. In its place stood walls of snow higher than a man's shoulders. Trees were bent or broken. Fences vanished beneath white mounds. He climbed higher to get a better view, heart pounding with each step. The settlement was barely recognizable. Several houses had collapsed completely, their roofs crushed under the weight of snow. Others stood blackened and hollow, victims of chimney fires that burned uncontrolled in the storm. No smoke rose now, no movement, no sound. Caleb's chest tightened. Then he saw them, figures moving slowly through the snow at the base of the slope. 3 at first, then more. People walking with stiff, uneven steps. Some supported each other. Some dragged makeshift sleds. All of them looked small against the mountain. They were coming uphill. They had nowhere else to go. Caleb stood frozen, emotions crashing into each other. Shock, fear, anger, disbelief. These were the same people who had turned away, the same voices that had laughed when they saw smoke rising from his cave. Now they were desperate. He watched as one man stumbled and fell, struggled to rise, then stayed down. Another figure knelt beside him, helpless. The distance between them and safety suddenly felt unbearable. Caleb didn't think anymore. He turned and ran back into the cave, throwing the door open wide, stoking the fire, clearing space. He laid out blankets, set water to warm, dragged supplies forward with shaking hands. When the first survivor reached the entrance and looked up at him, eyes hollow with exhaustion, Caleb saw something break inside that man's face. Disbelief, shame, hope. The cave they had mocked was still standing, and it was about to become the only thing standing between them and death. They came in one by one. Some couldn't meet Caleb's eyes. Others looked at him too long, as if trying to understand how the boy they dismissed had become the reason they were still breathing. He didn't ask questions. He didn't remind them of what they'd said. He just moved, steady and focused, the way his father once had in hard moments. Sit here, closer to the fire. Drink this slowly. Put your hands near the stone. It'll warm you. The cave filled with the sounds of survival, ragged breathing, quiet coughing, the scrape of boots against rock. Caleb wrapped blankets around shaking shoulders, poured water, shared what little food he had without hesitation. Every choice he'd made in preparation now mattered. Every shelf, every vent, every stubborn hour spent building when no one believed. By nightfall, the survivors were alive and safe. Word spread quickly among those who could still walk. More people came the next day, then the next. Some cried when they crossed the threshold. Some apologized. Some said nothing at all, their silence heavier than words. Caleb accepted them all the same. When the mountain finally allowed travel again, the truth became impossible to ignore. More than half the settlement was gone. Homes collapsed, supplies ruined, families displaced. The structures people trusted, the ones built the way things had always been done, had failed when it mattered most. And standing above them, solid and unbroken, was the cave home built by a boy no one thought would last a month. The town changed after that. People stopped calling it the cave. They called it the shelter. Men asked Caleb questions about airflow and stone. Women listened when he spoke about storage and cold. Not because he demanded respect, but because he had earned it without asking. Caleb never moved back down the mountain. He didn't need to. The cave became a gathering place in bad weather, a backup plan, a reminder. And slowly a few families began building their homes differently, closer to rock, shielded from wind, shaped by observation instead of habit. As for Caleb, he grew into the space he had carved for himself. He wasn't loud, he wasn't proud, but he was certain. He had learned something the storm made clear to everyone else too late. Survival isn't about strength or tradition or numbers. It's about paying attention. It's about humility. It's about preparing when others are laughing and opening your door when they come back afraid. So here's the question for you. If you were standing in that settlement, would you have trusted the house you inherited or the shelter everyone mocked? And if someone you once ignored showed up with the only safe place left, would you have been brave enough to ask for help? Stories like this remind us that wisdom doesn't always come from authority, and solutions don't always come from the crowd. Sometimes they come from the quiet ones who keep working while the rest of the world looks away. If this story moved you, made you think, or made you question what you believe about strength and survival, subscribe to the channel. We share powerful stories like this every week. Stories about resilience, humility, and the unexpected people who change everything when it matters most. Stay curious, stay prepared, and never underestimate the ones no one believes in.